You think you know how this story ends. You don't. Somewhere, right now, a research team is staring at something they can't explain. A find that shouldn't be possible. A date that doesn't add up. A discovery that contradicts everything printed in the textbooks on your shelf. This isn't ancient history, this is happening now, in 2026, in labs and dig sites and quiet offices where careers are being quietly upended. 14 discoveries. 14 cracks in everything we thought was settled. Ready? Let's get into it. In the dry limestone cliffs west of Luxor, where the Valley of the Kings gives way to a lesser-known stretch of wadis, a team of archaeologists stood before a staircase cut into rock that hadn't seen daylight in over 3,000 years. It was 2022 when they first found the entrance. It would take 3 more years of careful excavation before they understood what they were looking at. And even then, the answers raised more questions than they resolved. This was the tomb of Thutmose II, a pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty, who ruled sometime around 1493 to 1479 BC. His name is not among the most famous of Egypt's kings. He is remembered, if at all, as the husband and half-brother of Hatshepsut, the woman who would later rule as pharaoh in her own right, and as the father of Thutmose III, one of Egypt's greatest military leaders. Thutmose II himself left a modest historical footprint. A brief reign, a handful of inscriptions, and, until recently, no known tomb. That absence had puzzled Egyptologists for over a century. Every other pharaoh of the new kingdom had a resting place, however plundered, however damaged. Thutmose II did not. His mummy had been found decades earlier, tucked among a cache of royal remains hidden at Deir el-Bahari, bodies moved by ancient priests to protect them from tomb robbers. But the original tomb, the one built for him at the height of his power, was missing. Where had it gone? When the entrance was finally located in the western wadis, just north of where Hatshepsut would later build her own memorial temple, the excitement was immediate. This marked the first tomb belonging to a pharaoh discovered in Egypt since Tutankhamun's, over a century earlier. But what the team found inside was not the treasure-filled chamber that captured the world's imagination in 1922. It was something stranger. The tomb was empty, not looted in the conventional sense. No signs of the frantic, careless plundering typical of tomb robbers rushing to strip a burial of its gold. Instead, the chamber appeared to have been deliberately emptied, its contents removed with the kind of care usually reserved for objects still considered sacred. Fragments of alabaster vessels bearing the king's name remained. Traces of blue-painted ceiling meant to represent the heavens, dotted with yellow stars, still clung to the stone. But the sarcophagus, the grave goods, the mummy itself, all gone, relocated in antiquity to a destination that remains unknown. Why would ancient priests go to such lengths? The mainstream explanation points to water. Archaeologists found evidence that the tomb had flooded not long after the king's burial, a catastrophic event for a structure built in a wadi, a dry riverbed that occasionally and violently floods during rare desert storms. If water breached the chamber within years or even months of Thutmose II's death, his priests may have made the decision to move his body and burial goods to a safer, drier location before the damage became irreversible. This would align with what we already know. His mummy eventually surfaced in the Deir el-Bahari cache alongside other royals whose tombs had been compromised. Under this reading, the empty tomb is not a mystery so much as a footnote, a logistical response to a natural disaster, carried out by a bureaucracy well practiced in protecting its dead. And yet, some researchers have paused on the timing. Thutmose II's death came at a politically delicate moment. His son and heir, the future Thutmose III, was still a child. Power passed, unusually, to Hatshepsut, first as regent, then as pharaoh in her own right, a reign that would later see her name and image deliberately erased from monuments after her death. A campaign of removal historians still debate the motives behind. Was the relocation of Thutmose II's tomb purely a response to flood damage, or did it also serve the interests of a new regime seeking to control the narrative around a fragile succession? Egyptology has long shown that where a pharaoh was buried, and by whom, could carry as much political weight as where he sat on the throne while alive. Then there are the questions that sit further from the documented record, the ones whispered more than argued. Why does no funerary text, no inscription found anywhere in Egypt, specify exactly where Thutmose II's belongings were ultimately taken? Archaeologists have proposed a second, undiscovered tomb, a final resting place built to correct the failure of the first, hidden somewhere in the same stretch of cliffs, still sealed, still waiting. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the surrounding wadi have hinted at anomalies beneath the rubble, though nothing has been confirmed. Is there a second chamber, richer and more intact, still buried beneath the Theban hills? Or did the missing grave goods scatter across smaller caches, some found, some lost to robbers whose own history was never recorded? No one currently knows. What we have is a staircase, an empty room, a painted ceiling of fading stars, and a mummy found in the wrong place, 3,000 years removed from the tomb built to hold it. Perhaps the flood explanation is the whole story. Ancient Egypt kept meticulous records, after all, and disasters were far from rare along the Nile's edges. But standing in that quiet chamber, looking up at painted stars meant to guide a king through eternity, it is difficult not to wonder what else might be sitting beneath the sand nearby, and whether the priests who emptied this tomb left it that way for reasons we have only begun to understand. Beneath the shifting sands of Egypt's western wadis lies a mystery still guarded by stone and silence. Nearly 10,000 kilometers away, on the other side of the world, another set of ruins has recently forced historians to reconsider a chapter of human history they thought they understood. A story written not in hieroglyphs but in terraced stone rising from the Peruvian highlands. Roughly 200 kilometers north of Lima, where the Supe and Huara valleys cut through Peru's arid coastal desert before climbing into the Andes, sits a hillside settlement archaeologists have named Peñico. Announced to the world in 2025 after years of careful excavation, the site consists of stone platforms, circular plazas, and the remains of buildings arranged with a precision that speaks of planning, not chance. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at approximately 1800 to 1500 BC, a period when, according to conventional timelines, complex urban society in the Americas was only beginning to take shape. That dating alone would be enough to draw attention. But Peñico's significance runs deeper because of what came before it. Roughly 20 kilometers away lies Caral, the ruins of what many archaeologists consider the oldest known city in the Americas, and one of the oldest urban centers on Earth, predating the Egyptian pyramids, contemporaneous with early Mesopotamia. Caral flourished for centuries before its monumental core was abandoned, its purpose and the reasons for its decline still debated. For decades, the story of Caral's civilization seemed to end there. In that silence, a remarkable society that rose, built astonishing architecture without the wheel, without a written language as we understand it, without pottery in its earliest phases, and then simply faded from the record, leaving no clear successor. Peñico may change that story. Researchers, led by archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis, the same scholar whose decades of work first established Caral's antiquity, believe Peñico was built by descendants of the Caral civilization, constructed after the great city's decline, but carrying forward its architectural knowledge and, perhaps, its cultural memory. If this connection holds, it would mean Corral's influence did not simply vanish. It moved. It adapted. It found a new home in the hills above the valley, continuing in a different form. Why does this matter so much to historians? Because civilizations, in the traditional telling, are not supposed to disappear and reappear. They rise, they establish trade networks, they build monuments, and when they decline, the disruption tends to leave visible scars, abandoned sites, evidence of conflict or environmental collapse, a clear break in the archaeological record. Carroll's decline has never been fully explained. Some researchers point to shifting river patterns or prolonged drought. Others suggest the exhaustion of resources that sustained its trade-based economy. Still others wonder whether the answer lies not in collapse at all, but in transformation, a society that didn't fall, but relocated, restructured, and continued under a name history never recorded. Peñico sits at a position that makes this theory difficult to dismiss. The settlement occupies a strategic location, positioned at the convergence of routes connecting Peru's coast, its highlands, and the Amazonian lowlands beyond. Archaeologists have proposed that this was no accident, that Peñico may have functioned as a hub for exchange between three distinct ecological worlds, a role that would have required organized leadership, established trade relationships, and inherited knowledge of how such networks functioned. That kind of continuity doesn't emerge from nothing. It suggests institutional memory passed down across generations, even after the great plazas of Carol fell quiet. And yet, for all that the site tells us, it withholds just as much. Unlike Egypt, where hieroglyphic inscriptions often name kings and record events with startling specificity, the Carol Supa civilization and its apparent successors left no deciphered writing system. What we know of Peñico's builders comes entirely from what they left behind in stone, in the layout of their structures, in the objects buried within them, fragments of textiles, remnants of offerings, the bones of animals traded from regions far beyond the valley. There are no names, no recorded rulers, no inscriptions explaining why this particular hillside was chosen, or what ceremonies took place in its circular plazas. The people who built Peñico remain, in the most fundamental sense, anonymous, present in their architecture, absent from their own history. This silence has left room for competing interpretations, some grounded firmly in the archaeological evidence, others reaching further into speculation. The mainstream view holds that Peñico represents a natural, if remarkable, continuation of Andean civilization, a society adapting to environmental pressures, relocating to more defensible or resource-rich terrain, and preserving architectural traditions established generations earlier at Corral. Under this reading, the mystery isn't really a mystery at all. It's a missing chapter, now partially restored, in a story of resilience and cultural continuity that unfolded much as it did elsewhere in the ancient world. But other questions linger at the edges of the excavation reports, harder to dismiss and harder to answer. Why, for instance, does the transition between Corral's decline and Peñico's construction show so little overlap in the archaeological layers? A gap that some researchers read as evidence of a slow, generational migration, while others see as suspiciously abrupt for a civilization simply adapting to gradual environmental change. Why do certain structural elements at Peñico echo not just Corral, but architectural principles found in far more distant Andean sites built centuries later? A similarity that could reflect a shared cultural root passed down over an extraordinarily long span of time, or could simply be the natural result of builders working with the same materials and the same mountainous terrain, arriving independently at similar solutions. There is also the matter of what still lies unexcavated. Peñico itself was identified through a combination of surface surveys and targeted digging, but researchers acknowledge that only a portion of the site has been fully explored. The surrounding valley contains other unexamined mounds and terraces, some noted in early surveys decades ago but never fully investigated, due to limited funding and the sheer scale of Peru's archaeological landscape. A country whose ancient sites number in the tens of thousands, the overwhelming majority still unstudied. What else might these hills be holding? A more complete accounting of who lived at Peñico and how they understood their connection to the vanished city nearby. Or nothing more than further confirmation of what has already been proposed, a peaceful, continuous evolution of a civilization simply moving with the land. Some researchers, working at the more speculative edges of the field, have pointed to the broader puzzle Corral itself represents. A civilization that achieved monumental architecture, complex social organization, and long-distance trade without many of the hallmarks, pottery, writing, defensive fortifications, that archaeologists have traditionally associated with the rise of urban society elsewhere in the world. If Corral defied expectations once, could its descendants at Peñico be quietly revealing an even longer, more complex history of Andean civilization than currently accepted, one stretching back further or branching out wider than the existing record suggests? This remains, for now, an open question rather than an established finding, and most working archaeologists are careful to note the difference. What is certain is this: a hillside in Peru, silent for over 3,000 years, has forced a reconsideration of how one of the America's earliest civilizations came to an end, or whether it ended at all. Ruth Shady Solis and her team continue their work at the site, and further excavations are planned in the surrounding valley in the coming years. Until then, Peñico's terraces sit largely as they were left, its builders unnamed, its full purpose still unwritten. Was this truly the next chapter of Corral's story, carried forward by descendants determined to preserve what their ancestors built? Or does it represent something else entirely, a separate society that simply arrived at similar solutions to the same unforgiving landscape? The stones offer no answer, only the questions they continue to raise. From the terraced hillsides of Peru, where a civilization's descendants built new communities atop old memories, our journey now turns to the dense jungle canopy of Belize, where a husband and wife team of archaeologists reopened a chamber they had first touched more than 3 decades earlier, and found something none of them expected. Deep in the Cayo district of central Belize, roughly 53 miles from the Caribbean coast, the ruins of Carnyx rise from the jungle floor like the bones of a forgotten giant. At its peak during the 6th and 7th centuries AD, this was one of the largest cities in the Maya world, home to more than 100,000 people. Its territory sprawling across more than 68 square miles of causeways, agricultural terraces, and monumental architecture. At its heart stands Kana, a pyramid rising 140 feet above the forest canopy, still one of the tallest structures in Belize today. For over 4 decades, archaeologists Arlen and Diane Chase have devoted their careers to uncovering this city's secrets, excavating more than 850 burials and 175 tombs in the process. But in the summer of 2025, in a raised ceremonial complex known as the Northeast Acropolis, they found something that had eluded them for 40 years: the tomb of a king. The chamber itself told its own story before a single artifact was cataloged. Its walls were coated in red cinnabar, a mineral pigment reserved in Maya burial practice for individuals of the very highest status, a detail that told the Chases almost immediately that they were looking at royalty. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a man, elderly at the time of his death, roughly 5 feet 7 inches tall, his jaw showing signs that his body had reabsorbed his own teeth in the final years of his life. Surrounding him, 11 pottery vessels, carved bone tubes, jaded jewelry, Pacific spondylus shells, and a mosaic death mask of jade and shell, shattered into more than 100 fragments and painstakingly reassembled. Only the second such mask ever found at the site in 40 years of digging. 3 sets of jade ear flares accompanied him, a detail Diane Chase called incredibly unusual. Most tombs, if they contain any at all, hold only one. Based on the artifacts, the ceramic styles, and their position within the site's broader stratigraphy, the Chases have proposed that this is the tomb of Tecabchak, Caracol's founding king, the man who ascended to the throne in AD 331 and established a royal dynasty that would govern the city for more than 460 years. If they are right, this is the first identifiable ruler's tomb found at Caracol in the site's entire excavation history, and one of only a handful of dynasty founder burials ever positively identified anywhere in the Maya world. There's only one problem. No inscription inside the tomb names its occupant. No hieroglyphic text confirms his identity beyond doubt. The Chases have said they are 99.9% confident in their identification, based on the tomb's dating, its position relative to 2 related burials nearby, and its alignment with what is known of Tecabchak's reign from monuments elsewhere at the site. But outside experts have been more cautious. Some archaeologists not involved in the excavation have noted that without DNA confirmation or a direct inscription, the identification, however probable, remains an inference rather than a certainty. Ancient DNA analysis and isotope testing are now underway, results that may either confirm the Chase's conclusion or leave the tomb's occupant formally unnamed a while longer. Why does this matter so much? Because, if confirmed, the tomb does more than give a face to a name recorded in stone elsewhere at the site. It anchors an entire origin story. The moment a dynasty began, the man from whom more than 4 centuries of Caracol's kings claimed descent. Some of the pottery found in the chamber appears to support this. One vessel bears the image of a ruler holding a spear, receiving offerings from figures in the form of deities, while others carry lids modeled with the heads of Cotamundus, an animal whose Mayan name, Tsuts, would later appear as a part of the names taken by Caracol's subsequent rulers. If Tecabchak lies in this chamber, the symbolic thread connecting him to his descendants runs directly through these objects, but the mystery deepens the closer one looks at what surrounded him in death. 2 other burials found nearby and dated to roughly the same period, around AD 350, have forced archaeologists to reconsider not just who this man was, but who Caracol's early rulers were talking to. One of these burials was a cremation, accompanied by green obsidian blades sourced from Pachuca in central Mexico, and weaponry in a style associated with the Teotihuacan, the vast, powerful metropolis located over 200 kilometers away, near modern-day Mexico City. Conventional Maya history holds that formal contact between the Maya world and Teotihuacan began with a documented event in AD 378, known to scholars as the Entrada, recorded on monuments as a moment when foreign influence reshaped Maya political structures. Yet these burials at Caracol predate that event by at least a generation. Was Tecabchak's court already engaged in diplomatic or ritual exchange with this distant Mexican power decades before the history books say such contact began? Was the man interred in the cremation an envoy who had lived at Teotihuacan and returned home, carrying its customs with him? Or does the evidence simply reflect 2 great Mesoamerican civilizations independently arriving at parallel symbols of status and power, mistaken by modern eyes for direct contact? Not every scholar is convinced. Some archaeologists reviewing the Chase's preliminary findings have cautioned that the connections drawn between Caracol and Teotihuacan rest heavily on interpretation, associations of style and material that, while suggestive, fall short of definitive proof. What is undeniable is the pattern: 3 burials, clustered around the same few decades, each carrying fragments of a story that reaches far beyond the borders of this one city. And then there is the matter of Caracol's end. Like so many great Maya cities, it did not last forever. By roughly AD 900, Caracol had been abandoned, its causeways overtaken by jungle, its plazas left silent, part of the broader, still debated collapse that swept through the Maya lowlands at the close of the Classic period. Drought, warfare, environmental strain, political fragmentation, all have been proposed as causes, and likely all played some role. But knowing how a civilization ended does little to explain how it began, and it is that earlier question the tomb of Tekhab, if that is indeed who lies within it, was uncovered to help answer. For now, the chamber keeps part of its secret. The mask lies reassembled but silent. The bones await the results of laboratory analysis that may, in time, put a confirmed name to the man who once wore those jade ear flares into the afterlife. Until then, he remains what he has been for over 1,000 years, a king known almost certainly by his deeds and his dynasty, but not yet in the strictest scientific sense by his face. Was this truly the founder of Caracol's royal line? The man whose descendants ruled a city of 100,000 people for nearly 5 centuries? Or does the jungle still hold the real tomb of Tekhab somewhere nearby, waiting for a spade that has not yet struck the right patch of earth? 2 continents, 2 kings, both stripped of their names by time. And now, from the jungles of Belize, we return once more to the sands of Egypt, where another ruler waits in the dark, his identity dissolved by the same forces that once tried to erase him. Beneath Anubis Mountain, a natural rock formation shaped uncannily like a pyramid, on the desert edge west of the Nile near the ancient city of Abydos, a team of American and Egyptian archaeologists descended nearly 23 feet through sand and centuries to reach a chamber no living person had entered in over 3,000 years. What they found there, in January 2025, was a limestone burial vault with mud brick vaults rising 16 feet overhead, a tomb clearly built for a king. The trouble was, no one could say which one. Abydos has held secrets for as long as Egyptians have kept the records of themselves. Located roughly 6 miles from the Nile, the site was considered the burial place of Osiris, god of the underworld, and for this reason it became one of the most sacred cemeteries in the ancient world, the preferred resting place for the very first pharaohs, and for royalty who came long after them. Over centuries, dynasty after dynasty added tombs to this desert necropolis, layering history atop history in the sand beneath Anubis Mountain. Among the earliest, most famous names to rest there is Senusret III, a powerful 12th dynasty king whose tomb was first excavated in the early 20th century. But it is the more obscure occupants of this cemetery, the ones history nearly forgot entirely, who have drawn archaeologists back to Abydos in recent years. In 1997, Egyptologist Kim Ryholt proposed something that at the time had little physical evidence behind it: the theory of a lost Abydos dynasty, a lineage of kings who ruled this region during Egypt's Second Intermediate Period, a chaotic stretch between roughly 1640 and 1540 BC when the kingdom had fractured into rival territories, each claiming its own throne. It was, by most accounts, one of the murkiest chapters in Egyptian history, a period when kings sometimes ruled for only a handful of years before being replaced, and when the grand, unbroken narrative Egypt liked to tell about itself simply breaks down. Ryholt's theory sat unconfirmed for nearly 2 decades. Then, in 2014, archaeologist Josef Wegner and his team uncovered the tomb of a king named Seneb-K, a name that appeared nowhere in the traditional Egyptian king lists, the carefully maintained records ancient scribes used to present their history as clean, linear, and unbroken. Seneb-K simply wasn't supposed to exist. But there he was, entombed beneath the desert, proof that Ryholt's forgotten dynasty had been real all along. In the years since, 7 more tombs belonging to this same mysterious lineage have been identified nearby. Of all of them, Seneb-K's remains the only one where a name survived intact within the burial chamber. The rest are, in the most literal sense, anonymous, kings whose tombs exist, whose burial chambers were built with real labor and real intention, but whose identities have simply evaporated. The tomb, uncovered in January 2025, became the newest addition to this puzzle, and in some ways, the most tantalizing. Structurally, it echoed Seneb-K's tomb closely enough that archaeologists could immediately place it within the same dynasty, but it was considerably larger, its main chamber measuring nearly 20 feet in length, dwarfing the modest proportions of Seneb-K's hastily built resting place. Because it was constructed in a section of the necropolis researchers believe was established earlier, the team has proposed that this unnamed king may have been one of Seneb-K's predecessors, perhaps even one of the dynasty's founding rulers, a man wealthy and powerful enough to command significantly more labor than those who came after him. And yet his name is gone. At the tomb's entrance, hieroglyphic inscriptions painted in yellow, band across plastered brickwork, once identified the king within, flanked by images of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, both closely associated with funerary rites and the protection of the dead. But ancient tomb robbers, working sometime in antiquity, damaged those inscriptions badly enough that the name they once recorded can no longer be read. The looters took everything else too, the sarcophagus, the grave goods, even the king's mummy, leaving archaeologists with an empty chamber and no skeletal remains to analyze, no DNA to extract, nothing but stone, plaster, and absence. Wegener's team has suggested 2 possible candidates, a king named Senaib and another named Peñico, both of whom left behind monuments at Abydos, but whose tombs have never been located. Either could plausibly be the man once laid to rest in this chamber. But without a legible inscription or physical remains, the identification remains, at best, an educated guess. One Egyptologist among several floated as reasonable, none confirmed. Why does an entire dynasty of Egyptian kings simply vanish from the historical record their own civilization was so famous for keeping? The mainstream explanation lies in politics, not conspiracy. Egyptologist Laurel Bastock has pointed out that Egypt's official king lists were never meant to be a complete, neutral record. They were curated documents, arranged to present history as tidy and continuous, often compiled generations later by rulers with every incentive to write inconvenient chapters out entirely. A minor dynasty, ruling a fractured sliver of territory during a period of civil breakdown, may simply have been an embarrassment not worth remembering. Under this reading, the mystery isn't about what happened to these kings. It's about who decided, centuries after their deaths, that they didn't deserve to be written down at all. But other questions resist such a tidy resolution. If the newly found tomb does belong to a founding figure of the Abydos line, why was it built with such evident wealth and ambition, only for the dynasty's later kings, including Seneb-K, to be buried in progressively smaller, hastier structures? Does this reflect a dynasty in decline, its resources dwindling generation by generation as rival kingdoms squeezed it from every side? Or does it suggest something more abrupt, a single moment of crisis that forced an entire royal line into sudden, permanent austerity? And with 7 tombs in this necropolis still lacking confirmed names, and Wegener's team continuing excavations at Anubis Mountain in the seasons ahead, how many more chapters of this ghost dynasty, as some researchers have taken to calling it, remain buried just beneath the next stretch of sand. For now, the unnamed king sleeps in a chamber built to honor him, protected by goddesses whose images have outlasted his own. Whoever he was, he ruled, he was buried with real ceremony, and then, for 3,500 years, the sand simply closed back over him and over his name. 2 continents, 2 kings, both stripped of their names by time. And now our path climbs upward, out of the desert sand and into thin mountain air, to a windswept plateau in eastern Turkey where the ruins waiting to be found weren't buried at all. They were simply too high, too remote, and too forgotten for anyone to notice. The Tirişin Plateau sits in Van's Gürpınar district, in the far eastern reaches of Turkey, at an elevation of roughly 3,000 meters, nearly 10,000 feet above sea level. It is not a place people stumble upon by accident. To reach it, a research team led by Professor Rafet Çavuşoğlu of Van Yüzüncü Yıl University had to hike for 2 hours across rugged, windswept terrain, part of a 12-person expedition that included archaeologists, anthropologists, and art historians, conducted with support from Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism. What they found waiting for them at the top, in the summer of 2025, was not a modest ruin. It was a fortress complex on a scale few had anticipated at such an altitude. Nearly 50 rooms and defensive stone walls stretching across roughly 4 kilometers of mountaintop, built from locally sourced basalt. At the center of the complex stood a large keep, which researchers believe served as an administrative hub for the surrounding region, a seat of authority perched above the clouds. Surrounding it, dozens of smaller chambers extended outward. Residential quarters, storage spaces, and rooms whose specific functions remain, for now, still under study. The scale of construction alone raised an immediate question. Why would anyone go to such extraordinary lengths, hauling stone, organizing labor, sustaining a population, to build so extensively at an elevation where the air itself grows thin and winters turn brutal? The leading explanation points to the Urartians, a Bronze and Iron Age kingdom that dominated eastern Anatolia between roughly the 9th and 6th centuries BC, stretching across territory that today spans eastern Turkey, Armenia, and parts of northwestern Iran. The Urartians were renowned fortress builders, famous for anchoring their power through mountain strongholds engineered to control strategic terrain, a defensive philosophy that shaped much of the region's ancient landscape, including well-documented sites like Çavuştepe Castle, excavated by this same research team in earlier seasons. Under this reading, the Tirişin fortress fits a known pattern: a highland power projecting control over resource-rich terrain, using elevation itself as a defensive weapon no invading army could easily overcome. And the location does seem to support that theory. The Tirişin Plateau isn't simply high, it's rich. Researchers have noted abundant water sources and fertile grazing lands, ideal conditions for the kind of semi-nomadic pastoralism that has sustained highland communities in this region for thousands of years. A practice Çavuşoğlu notes continues in the area even today. A fortress positioned here would have offered its occupants a rare combination: natural defenses, controlled access to prime grazing territory, and oversight of a landscape valuable enough to be worth defending. Ceramic shards, millstones, and carved stones recovered at the site suggest the complex wasn't purely military. Over time, it appears to have functioned as something closer to a small, self-sustaining highland community, part garrison, part economic center, part shelter against a landscape that offers little forgiveness to the unprepared. But the fortress's story doesn't end with the Urartians, and this is where the picture grows harder to pin down. Researchers have determined that the site was reoccupied and redeveloped well beyond the Iron Age, continuing to be used into the medieval period, meaning that whatever purpose this mountaintop once served under Urartian rule, later cultures found reason to return to it, generation after generation, rebuilding and repurposing what earlier hands had left behind. Layered occupation like this is not unusual at strategically valuable sites, but it does complicate the picture considerably. Which structures date to the original Urartian construction, and which were added centuries later by cultures with entirely different needs? At 3,000 meters, with excavation only in its earliest stages, that layering has not yet been fully untangled. Then there is the plateau itself, older, it turns out, than the fortress that came to dominate it. The Tirişin Plateau is home to an unusually large concentration of petroglyphs, ancient rock carvings scattered across the landscape, including distinctive depictions of ox carts alongside obsidian artifacts suggesting a human presence stretching back to the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a presence that predates the Urartian fortress by thousands of years. Long before any king ordered a single basalt stone laid for defensive walls, people were already climbing to this same remote plateau, carving images into rock that would outlast them by millennia. Why here? What drew human activity to this particular stretch of high, harsh terrain across such an enormous span of time? From the earliest carvers to the Urartian builders to the medieval occupants who came after. Archaeologists are careful, at this stage, not to overreach. The connection between the Neolithic rock art and the much later fortress may be nothing more than coincidence. Different peoples separated by thousands of years, independently recognizing the same practical advantages of water, grazing land, and elevation that make a location worth returning to again and again. That is the grounded, evidence-based reading, and it is likely correct. But it leaves an undeniable pull to the imagination. A single plateau, chosen and rechosen by human beings across an almost unbroken chain of millennia, each culture layering its own mark onto stone that had already been marked by those who came long before. Excavation at Tirişin has only just begun. Researchers plan to continue mapping the full extent of the fortress walls, and to determine more precisely which sections belong to which era of occupation. For now, the fortress keeps its silence at the top of the world, wrapped in thin air and centuries of use, whose full story is still being pieced together stone by stone. What, exactly, made this remote, punishing summit worth returning to again and again by people separated from one another by thousands of years? And what does it say about a landscape, however inhospitable it appears from below, that so many different civilizations looked up at it and decided, this is where we build? From a mountain fortress guarding thin air and open grazing land, our story now descends to level ground, to a quiet construction site in the English countryside, where the routine business of laying foundations for new houses uncovered something that hadn't seen daylight in 2,000 years. In the summer of 2025, in the county of Norfolk, in eastern England, a team from Pre-Construct Archaeology was carrying out exactly the kind of survey that happens before nearly any housing development in Britain, a standard procedural check required by planning law, meant to confirm that construction wouldn't disturb anything of historical significance. It is the kind of work that, more often than not, turns up little of note. This time, a few miles from the market town of Thetford, on privately owned land whose precise location has deliberately not been disclosed, it turned up one of the most significant Iron Age discoveries Britain has seen in generations. Buried within the soil was a hoard of bronze objects, 5 shield bosses, an unidentified iron object, fragments of a second, less complete instrument, and at the center of it all, a nearly intact Carnyx. To understand why archaeologists reacted the way they did, it helps to understand just how rare that word is. A Carnyx was a Celtic war trumpet, typically standing close to 2 meters tall when played. its bell cast in the shape of an animal head. A boar, a wolf, a serpent, mounted on a long pipe and raised high above the heads of warriors in battle. These instruments produced a deep, unsettling sound designed to intimidate enemies and rally troops, and they were distinctive enough that Roman artists depicted them on triumphal monuments as far away as Delphi, treating captured Carnyxes as trophies worthy of permanent commemoration. Despite their fame across the ancient world, only 3 examples have ever been found in all of Britain. The Norfolk Carnyx is not just one of them. With its pipe, mouthpiece, and bell all intact, it stands as one of the most complete ever recovered anywhere in Europe. Alongside it lay something Britain had never produced before: a sheet bronze boar's head, the remnant of a military standard, the first artifact of its kind ever discovered in the country. The boar held deep significance in Celtic military culture, appearing repeatedly across coins, helmets, weapons, and depictions of deities throughout Iron Age Europe. A boar standard found beside a boar-headed Carnyx is difficult to read as coincidence. Taken together, the hoard points towards something deliberately assembled: military regalia belonging to a specific unit, a specific ritual, or a specific moment in time, rather than a random accumulation of scattered valuables. Archaeologists dated the hoard to roughly the late Iron Age, somewhere between 50 BC and 50 AD, buried in territory long associated with the Iceni, the tribe of eastern Britain whose queen, Boudica, would later lead a major uprising against Roman occupation around AD 60 or 61. Whether this hoard has any direct connection to Boudica's rebellion remains unconfirmed. The burial predates her revolt, and researchers are careful not to draw too straight a line between the two. But the timing sits within the same charged decades, a period of mounting Roman pressure on British tribes, when the political ground beneath communities like the Iceni was shifting in ways that would soon erupt into open conflict. Why bury something this valuable, this carefully made, and simply never come back for it? Archaeologists studying the hoard have pointed to 2 competing explanations, neither of which cancels the other out entirely. The first is straightforward and grounded firmly in the turbulence of the period. Political crisis or military defeat may have forced whoever owned these objects to hide them for safekeeping, intending to return once danger passed, a return that, for reasons lost to history, never happened. Perhaps the owner died in battle. Perhaps the surrounding conflict made retrieval impossible. Objects like these, made of thin, fragile bronze sheeting, were valuable enough that no one would abandon them carelessly. The second explanation reaches towards something less pragmatic and more difficult to prove: ritual deposition, a practice well documented across Iron Age Europe, in which valuable objects were deliberately given to the earth, offerings buried not to be recovered, but to be released. Under this theory, the hoard wasn't hidden in a moment of panic at all. It was placed with intention, perhaps to mark a specific event, honor a fallen leader, or fulfill some obligation to gods whose names and demands have long since been forgotten. The careful arrangement of the objects lends some support to this reading. When the hoard was lifted intact, preserved within a block of surrounding soil to protect its exact spatial context, CT and X-ray imaging at Norfolk Museum Service revealed a deliberate structure to how the pieces had been placed. 2 Carnyx, a matched boar standard, 5 shield bosses, arranged in a way that some researchers believe reflects intentional curation, rather than the disorganized concealment of someone fleeing danger. We may never know which explanation is correct, or whether both, in some measure, played a role. What we do know is what the objects themselves can still tell us, now that conservation work has begun at Norfolk Museum Service in partnership with the National Museum of Scotland, home to one of the world's leading collections of Carnyx research. Experimental reconstructions based on other surviving examples, such as Scotland's more complete Deskford Carnyx, have already given researchers a reasonable sense of what an instrument like this might have sounded like when played at full volume above a battlefield. But sound is not the same as meaning. We can recreate the note, we cannot yet recover the moment. The legal status of the hoard currently rests with a coroner, working under Britain's Treasure Act to determine what becomes of it next. Full research has barely begun. The bronze itself remains fragile, brittle after 2,000 years underground, requiring careful, patient stabilization before scholars can study it in depth. Somewhere in the arrangement of those 5 shield bosses, that boar-headed trumpet, and its unnamed twin lies the answer to a question archaeologists may spend years untangling. Was this the desperate concealment of a community bracing for war, or a solemn offering made to gods who were never meant to give the trumpet back? The soil that held this hoard for 2,000 years has finally released it. Whether it will ever release the full story is another matter entirely. Where Norfolk's soil kept its secrets for 2,000 years, our story now returns to Egypt's Mediterranean coast, where the dead were not buried in silence at all. They were buried, prepared to speak. Roughly 100 kilometers west of Alexandria, along a stretch of coastline now known as Marina el Alamein, lies the site of an ancient city the Greek geographer Strabo once called Leukaspis, a name meaning roughly white shield. For centuries, this settlement served as a bustling waypoint for trade and cultural exchange between Egypt and the wider Mediterranean world, its harbor connecting the Nile Delta to the shipping lanes of Rome, Greece, and beyond. The site was first identified by archaeologists in 1986, and in the decades since, excavation has slowly revealed it to be one of the best preserved coastal settlements from the classical period anywhere in Egypt. In the summer of 2026, that slow work yielded its most striking discovery yet. An Egyptian archaeological mission announced the excavation of 18 new tombs at Leukaspis, dating to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, 11 rock-cut chambers reaching some 8 meters underground, and 7 additional surface tombs constructed from carefully fitted limestone blocks, several still sealed beneath their original coverings after roughly 2,000 years. Together, these new finds brought the total number of tombs identified at the site since its discovery to 44. Inside, archaeologists uncovered a large granite sarcophagus, 2.5 meters long, its occupant's remains still present within. Around it, ceramic vessels, amphorae, oil lamps, small stone altars, and basins, the ordinary material culture of ancient burial practice, carefully arranged for people the excavators are still working to identify. But it was a smaller, stranger category of object that gave the discovery its name. Scattered among the burials, archaeologists recovered 24 thin sheets of gold foil, each one shaped into the unmistakable form of a human tongue. These were not decorative flourishes. They had been placed directly inside the mouths of the deceased, tucked behind the teeth in the place where a living tongue would rest, as part of a deliberate and evidently important step in the burial process. The practice itself is not entirely without precedent. Golden tongue amulets have surfaced at other Egyptian sites in recent years. A mummy uncovered near Taposiris Magna in 2021, a cemetery extension near Cairo in 2022, and Roman-era burials at Oxyrhynchus more recently still. Egyptologists have offered a consistent explanation across these finds. In the belief system of Greco-Roman Egypt, where Egyptian funerary tradition had blended with the influences of its Hellenistic rulers and Roman administrators, the dead were thought to require the ability to speak once they crossed into the underworld, to identify themselves, to make their case, to be heard by Osiris, the god who presided over judgment in the afterlife. If the natural tongue failed, decayed, or simply wasn't trusted to survive the journey, a golden one, incorruptible and eternal, would do the speaking instead. That is the mainstream reading, and it is well supported by Egypt's broader funerary tradition, in which amulets served precise, specialized functions: a heart scarab to protect the organ of judgment, a two-fingered amulet to guard an embalming incision, each object assigned to a specific bodily need in the afterlife. Under this framework, the golden tongues of Leukaspis fit naturally into a known and well-documented practice, one already observed at other sites across Egypt's Ptolemaic and Roman-era cemeteries. And yet the sheer concentration of the find at Leukaspis raises questions that isolated discoveries elsewhere have not. 24 golden tongues across 18 tombs is a striking density for a single excavation season, far more than the handful of individual examples reported at other sites in recent years. Why would this particular community, in this particular coastal city, adopt the practice with such apparent consistency? Was Leukaspis home to a specially devoted cult of Osiris, whose priests insisted on the ritual for nearly every burial that passed through their hands? Or does the answer lie in the city's role as a Mediterranean crossroads, a place where Greek, Roman, and Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife mixed and reinforced one another, producing a hybrid funerary culture more elaborate and more anxious about the journey into the next world than what took root elsewhere along the Nile? There is also the matter of what the researchers cannot yet answer. Golden tongues speak symbolically for the dead, but they say nothing about who those dead were in life. With identification work still ongoing, the specific individuals buried at Leukaspis, their names, their occupations, their place within this trading city's social order, remain unknown. Alongside the golden tongues, excavators also recovered an amulet depicting the Eye of Horus, a symbol of protection and healing invoked across countless Egyptian burials for millennia, a detail that underscores just how thoroughly older Egyptian religious tradition persisted, layered beneath the Greek name of the city and the Roman administrative structures that eventually governed it. Some researchers examining sites like this one have raised a further, more speculative question: whether the specific choice of gold, rather than the cheaper materials such as bronze or faience used for tongue amulets found elsewhere, signals something about the wealth or status of Leucaspis's inhabitants, or whether it reflects a particular urgency, a belief that only incorruptible gold could be trusted to carry a voice safely into eternity. Neither explanation has been confirmed, and researchers are careful to note that burial customs, even within a single region, could vary considerably based on family tradition, local priesthood, and personal means. What remains certain is this: for nearly 2,000 years, dozens of individuals lay beneath the coastal sand near Leukaspis, golden tongues resting silently in their jaws, prepared for a conversation with the god of the underworld that, as far as we know, never came. Now that the ground has given them back, the question shifts to us. What did these people believe waited for them in the dark? And with 26 tombs still unopened at the site since excavation began in 1986, how many more voices, cast in gold and pressed into silence, remain waiting beneath that quiet stretch of Mediterranean coastline? From the coastal tombs of Leukaspis, where golden tongues once waited to speak for the dead, our journey now turns inland, deep into Egypt's western desert, where an entire lost city has emerged from the sand almost fully intact. Its streets, its homes, and even the names of some of its residents still legible after 16 centuries of silence. The Dakhla Oasis sits in Egypt's New Valley Governorate, a pocket of green sustained by underground water in the midst of one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth, a place so significant to the region's history that it now sits on UNESCO's tentative list, one step from full World Heritage status. It is here, at a site known as Ain al-Sabel, that an Egyptian archaeological mission from the Supreme Council of Antiquities has spent recent seasons uncovering something remarkable. Not a scattering of ruins, not a single building of note, but what researchers are calling one of the most complete Byzantine period urban settlements ever found in Egypt's western desert. A 4th century city, built entirely of mud brick, emerging from beneath the sand with its layout, its buildings, and much of its daily infrastructure still intact. Walk the excavated streets, at least in imagination, and the city's plan reveals itself with startling clarity. Wide north-south thoroughfares intersect with smaller east-west streets, forming open public squares in a deliberate, organized grid. This was no haphazard cluster of desert dwellings, but a settlement planned with real municipal intention. At its heart stands a Basilica-style Christian church, dating to the mid-4th century AD, positioned to overlook one of the city's principal streets, clearly intended as both a religious and communal focal point. Around its perimeter, archaeologists have identified the remains of 2 watchtowers and a heavily fortified structure with thick defensive walls, a city that, for all its evident civic order, also anticipated the need to defend itself. The residential quarters tell an even more intimate story. Excavators uncovered homes with spacious reception halls and vaulted ceilings, complete with bread ovens, kitchens, and stone tools used for grinding grain, the physical residue of ordinary domestic life. Meals prepared and shared in rooms that had stood empty and buried for over 1,600 years. 2 houses in particular have drawn special attention. One belonged to a man named Thutmose, identified through inscriptions as a church deacon who lived during the second half of the 4th century. The other, older still, belonged to a man named Abydos, and researchers believe this second house may have functioned as an informal house church, a gathering place for the city's Christian community before the grander Basilica was ever built. Somewhere in that transition, from a private home doubling as a place of worship to a dedicated church standing at the city's civic center, lies a small, human window into how Christianity took root and formalized itself in one of Egypt's most remote desert communities. Then there are the ostraca, nearly 200 inscribed pottery fragments, used throughout the ancient world as an informal but remarkably durable writing surface. Found at Ain al-Sabel, bearing texts in both Coptic and Greek, these fragments recorded the mundane business of daily existence, commercial transactions, correspondence, the small bureaucratic and personal exchanges that rarely survive from antiquity, precisely because they were never meant to last. Alongside them, archaeologists recovered gold coins dating to the reign of the Roman Emperor Constantius II, who ruled from AD 337 to 361, a detail that helps anchor the city's active period with unusual precision, tying it directly to a known and well-documented moment in imperial history. Taken together, these finds paint a picture that, on its surface, requires no great mystery to explain. This was a functioning provincial city within the Byzantine Empire's Egyptian territories, populated by ordinary people, governed by the same imperial administration that stretched from Constantinople across the Mediterranean world, and increasingly shaped by the spread of Christianity that was, by the 4th century, transforming religious life across the empire. The presence of named individuals, a deacon, a house owner turned informal church host, combined with dated coinage and multilingual written records, gives researchers an unusually rich, unusually well-anchored data set. Many ancient settlements yield artifacts without context. Ain al-Sabel is offering both artifacts and names, dates, and functions, a combination archaeologists rarely get to work with all at once. And yet, the very completeness of what has been found raises its own quieter questions, ones that speak less to conspiracy and more to the puzzle of the desert itself. and why some places choose to give up their secrets so much more generously than others. Why, for instance, does this particular city survive in such remarkable condition? Its street grid legible, its buildings standing to a degree rarely seen at comparable Byzantine sites elsewhere in Egypt? The straightforward answer lies in the very environment that makes Dakhla so inhospitable to modern visitors. The extreme aridity of Egypt's western desert, far removed from the Nile's periodic flooding and the centuries of continuous urban rebuilding that erased so much of Egypt's ancient layers of settlement elsewhere. Mud brick, a material that dissolves quickly in wetter climates, can persist for well over 1,000 years in a desert this dry, provided nothing disturbs it. Under this reading, Ain al-Sabel isn't unusual because something extraordinary preserved it. It's unusual because the desert simply left it alone, undisturbed by the flooding, rebuilding, and repeated habitation that erased so many of Egypt's other ancient cities layer by layer. But why was it left alone in the first place? Cities do not typically empty themselves and stay empty for over a millennium without some triggering event, and researchers have not yet offered a confirmed explanation for what caused this particular settlement's population to disperse or when precisely that departure occurred. Excavation at the site remains ongoing, with each new season reportedly adding further pieces to the picture, and the full extent of the city, how large it grew, how long it was inhabited, and what ultimately led to its abandonment, has not yet been fully mapped. Was the oasis's crucial water supply disrupted by shifting environmental conditions, a vulnerability that desert communities throughout history have faced when their underground aquifers shifted or diminished? Did the city's population simply migrate toward larger, better connected urban centers as Byzantine administrative priorities shifted over the following centuries? Or does some more specific historical event, a piece of the story not yet uncovered in the ostraca or the archaeological layers, explain why an evidently thriving, well-organized community with its own church, its own watchtowers, and its own written records eventually went silent? There is also the matter of what still lies beneath the surrounding sand. Archaeologists have been careful to describe Ain al-Sabel as one of the most significant Byzantine settlements found in Egypt's western desert to date, a phrase that implicitly acknowledges how much work remains. The excavated portion represents what has been uncovered so far, not necessarily the full extent of the ancient city. Given how much has already emerged intact from a single set of excavation seasons, a basilica, fortifications, named residences, hundreds of inscribed texts, imperial coinage, it is reasonable to wonder how much more of this settlement's story remains buried just beyond the current excavation boundary. Further residential districts, additional religious structures, perhaps even records that might finally explain in the residents' own words why they eventually left. For now, Ain al-Sabel stands as a rare kind of archaeological gift, a city that speaks for itself in unusual detail, offering names, dates, and daily routines rather than only silent stone. But even a city this well-preserved keeps its final chapter to itself. Somewhere beneath the unexcavated sand surrounding Thutmose's home and the basilica he may have served, the answer to how and why this desert community's story ended may still be waiting. Until the next excavation season reveals more, the people of this 4th century oasis city remain known to us by their houses, their coins, and their pottery fragments, but not yet by the reason they, and eventually their city, fell silent. From a desert oasis, where a Byzantine city gave up its streets and its names, our path returns once more to England. This time, not to open farmland, but to the very heart of London's financial district, where the ordinary business of demolishing a 1930s office block uncovered the beating heart of the city's earliest incarnation. Beneath the basement of an aging commercial building at 85 Gracechurch Street, in the district Londoners still call the Square Mile, archaeologists from the Museum of London Archaeology, known by the acronym MOLA, began digging exploratory pits in preparation for redevelopment. What they found, several feet down, was a section of Roman masonry so substantial that it stopped the work in its tracks. "In one trench, we hit a massive piece of masonry," recalled Sophie Jackson, MOLA's Director of Development, describing a wall 3 or 4 feet wide that once the excavation area was extended, simply kept going. What the team had uncovered was part of the nave wall of London's first basilica, the central civic hall of Roman Londinium, buried and largely forgotten beneath nearly 2,000 years of continuous urban rebuilding. To understand why archaeologists reacted with such evident excitement, it helps to understand what a basilica actually was in the Roman world. Far more than a single building, it functioned as the administrative, judicial, and commercial heart of any significant Roman settlement, the place where magistrates presided over legal disputes, where merchants closed major deals, and where officials delivered the civic proclamations that shaped daily life for the population. As Jackson put it, it's the sort of heart of any significant Roman town. The London Basilica formed part of a larger forum complex, an open courtyard roughly the size of a football pitch, surrounded by public buildings that together constituted Londinium's central gathering place. Construction is believed to have begun around AD 80 during the governorship of Agricola, a period securely documented by ancient historians thanks to the biography his son-in-law Tacitus later wrote about him. This timing matters more than it might first appear. Londinium had been established only a few decades earlier, around AD 47 or 48, on previously unoccupied land beside the Thames. Its early growth had been violently interrupted in AD 60 or 61, when the settlement was destroyed during the revolt led by the Celtic queen Boudica, the same uprising connected to the Iceni tribe whose war trumpet would resurface 2,000 years later in a Norfolk field. London's recovery from that devastation was not guaranteed. Building a basilica standing roughly 40 feet tall, unlike anything British audiences had seen before, represented what Jackson has called a deliberate vote of confidence in the city's future, a declaration, cast in stone, flint, and Kentish limestone, that Londinium intended not just to survive, but to become something significant within the wider Roman world. The physical remains bear this ambition out. The basilica measured roughly 40 meters by 20, standing 2.5 stories tall, with walls in places over 10 meters wide and 4 meters deep, built from flint, ragstone, and locally fired Roman tile. Among the recovered artifacts was a roof tile stamped with the mark of an official from the ancient city, and, more strikingly, a tile still bearing the fingerprints of the Roman worker who shaped it nearly 2,000 years ago. "You can literally put your fingers in their finger marks on the tile," noted Andrew Henderson Schwartz of MOLA, describing it as a tangible, almost startlingly intimate connection to the anonymous laborers who built the city's earliest civic monument. Here is where the story, already remarkable, takes its more genuinely puzzling turn. This original basilica, grand, deliberately imposing, built to signal Londinium's permanence, was used for only about 20 years before being demolished and replaced by a significantly larger structure as a part of a new forum complex. By the 2nd century AD, Londinium had grown dramatically, its population estimated between 45,000 and 60,000 people, eventually overtaking Camalodunum, modern Colchester, as the capital of Roman Britain. Under the straightforward, well-supported explanation, this rapid replacement simply reflects a boomtown outgrowing its own ambitions faster than anyone could have anticipated. a city expanding so quickly in its first Roman-era generation that a monumental civic building, barely 2 decades old, had already become too small for the population it was meant to serve. That explanation accounts for the basic timeline, but it leaves researchers, by their own admission, without a complete picture of exactly why the decision was made when it was, or what specific pressures, administrative, demographic, or political, triggered the decommissioning of a structure that had only recently represented such a significant civic investment. Mola's own team has been candid about this gap. As the excavation continues, researchers hope future seasons will help answer precisely why, in Henderson Schwartz's words, the original forum was only used for 20 years before being replaced by a much larger one, a replacement that itself would go on to serve the city for roughly 3 centuries, until the collapse of Roman administration in Britain in the early 5th century. There is also the matter of scale, and how much of this story still lies beneath the modern city, entirely undiscovered. Archaeologists and historians had long suspected the general location of London's first basilica, thanks to sporadic evidence gathered since the 19th century, including a small, inconclusive glimpse of Roman era remains uncovered decades ago during the installation of a building lift shaft on the very same site. But as researcher Peter Marsden noted in his own study of the site decades before the recent excavation, more than half of the archaeological deposits connected to London's Forum Basilica complex were understood to remain unexplored, awaiting only the right opportunity for careful, systematic excavation. That opportunity arrived only because the building above happened to be scheduled for demolition and redevelopment. A reminder that so much of what lies beneath modern London remains inaccessible, not because it has been thoroughly studied and understood, but simply because the city built directly on top of it, layer after layer, for nearly 2,000 uninterrupted years. London's ground level itself has risen considerably since Roman times, burying the streets and buildings of Londinium as deep as 7 meters below the current surface in places. Every new excavation into this buried world, this basilica, but also the Roman amphitheater preserved beneath the Guildhall Art Gallery, and the Temple of Mithras now incorporated into a modern office development elsewhere in the city, offers only a narrow window into a much larger, still largely unmapped Roman city sitting directly beneath one of the world's most densely developed financial districts. Some of it will likely never be excavated at all, sealed permanently beneath the foundations of buildings that show no sign of coming down anytime soon. The site's owners, Hirchton Properties, have committed to preserving the newly uncovered basilica walls within their planned redevelopment, incorporating a glass floor that will allow future visitors to look directly down onto Roman masonry nearly 2,000 years old, in its original location, beneath the same streets office workers walk every day without a second thought. It is, in its way, a fitting resolution. Not a final answer to why the first basilica gave way so quickly to its successor, but a permanent, physical acknowledgement that the question remains open. How much more of Roman Londinium sits directly beneath London's modern streets, its office towers and its underground rail lines, visible only in the narrow moments when a building comes down and a shovel finally has the chance to dig? And what does it say about a city that its ancient foundation, quite literally, has never stopped being built over? From the buried civic heart of Roman London, our journey now sweeps eastward, across the breadth of a continent, to a windswept plain near Azerbaijan's western borders, a place so remote that its silence, until recently, had gone entirely undisturbed for nearly 4,000 years. The Seyranchol Plain stretches across western Azerbaijan, close to where the country's borders meet both Georgia and Armenia, within a region known as the Kechelekeran State Historical and Cultural Reserve, a landscape already recognized for its natural caves, ancient fortresses, and early Christian monasteries scattered across the terrain. It was here, in a locality known as Yovşanlıdere, that a team of researchers, working as part of a long-running collaboration between Azerbaijan's Ministry of Culture and the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology of the Azerbaijan National Academy of Sciences, uncovered something that would soon draw attention from archaeologists across the Eurasian world: a kurgan, one of the massive earthen burial mounds built by ancient steppe cultures, measuring an imposing 28 meters across and rising 2 meters above the surrounding plain. Kurgans themselves are not unusual in this part of the world. Azerbaijan alone contains hundreds of them, scattered across a landscape long favored by Bronze Age communities, and later by nomadic cultures such as the Scythians and early Turkic peoples who used these earthen mounds to mark the graves of warriors and high-status individuals. But what the excavation team, led by Dr. Shamil Najafov of ANAS, found beneath this particular mound set it apart even within that well-documented tradition. Roughly half a meter beneath the surface, the team uncovered 14 massive limestone slabs, each weighing approximately 1 ton, laid in opposing rows across the top of the burial structure. A construction effort that would have required significant coordinated labor long before the invention of wheeled transport made such tasks easier. At the head of this stone covering sat a carved idol shaped like a bull, a detail immediately suggestive of the spiritual symbolism embedded in the burial's design. Beneath the stones, the burial chamber itself extended 6 meters in length, 2 meters in width, and 3 meters in depth, a substantial structure, divided deliberately into 3 distinct sections. One held the human remains and personal equipment of the deceased. A second was filled with ceramic vessels. The third, strikingly, was left completely empty. That empty chamber has become one of the excavation's most quietly compelling details. Researchers have proposed that this deliberate void may reflect a symbolic belief about the afterlife, perhaps a space intended for the deceased's soul to rest or to be nourished on its journey beyond death. It is, notably, an interpretation offered with appropriate caution. Without written records from the culture that built this tomb, any reading of its symbolic intent remains an informed inference rather than a certainty. But the deliberateness of the chamber's construction, 3 sections, each apparently built for a distinct purpose, one of them intentionally left bare, argues against pure coincidence. Someone planned this space with specific ideas in mind about what the dead would need and what they would not. At the center of it all lay the tomb's occupant, a man estimated, based on skeletal analysis, to have stood over 2 meters tall, roughly 6 feet 7 inches, a genuinely imposing height by the standards of any era, let alone the Middle Bronze Age, around 1800 BC. He had been buried in a semi-flexed position, his body curled rather than laid flat, a burial posture common across many ancient cultures but one that still required deliberate, ritual handling. In one hand, he held a bronze spearhead of a distinctive 4-pronged design, a weapon type archaeologists have described as extraordinarily rare, not merely within Azerbaijan, but across the entire South Caucasus region. Around one ankle, researchers found bronze ornamental adornments. Nearby lay beads made of paste, tools crafted from obsidian, and 12 ceramic jugs, elaborately decorated with dotted, hammered, and stamped patterns, their surfaces inlaid with a white substance to make the design stand out even more vividly against the clay. Several of these jugs held something more than decoration: the cooked bones of goats, cattle, horses, and wild boar, carefully placed within the vessels. Archaeologists have interpreted this reasonably as provisions for the afterlife, sustenance meant to accompany the dead man on whatever journey his community believed awaited him. This detail, combined with the weapon in his hand and the sheer scale of the burial structure built around him, has led researchers to a fairly confident conclusion. This was no ordinary community member. The wealth of goods, the specialized weapon, the labor invested in 14 one-ton capstones, and the elaborate three-part chamber all point toward a figure of considerable status. Very likely, in the assessment of the excavation team, a military leader whose community wished to honor him with a burial matching his standing in life. That is the grounded, well-supported reading of the evidence, and it accounts for most of what has been found. But several details continue to invite closer scrutiny, questions the current evidence can gesture toward without fully resolving. Why, for instance, was this particular man so remarkably tall? At over 2 meters, his stature would have distinguished him dramatically from the general population of the Middle Bronze Age South Caucasus, where average heights were considerably shorter. Was this simply natural human variation, the kind that occasionally produces individuals of exceptional height in any population across history? Or did his physical stature itself contribute to his selection as a warrior and leader, in a culture where imposing size may have carried genuine strategic or symbolic value on the battlefield? Planned isotope and metallographic analyses, along with radiocarbon dating, may help researchers better understand not just when this man lived, but potentially where he grew up and what his life entailed, work that remains ongoing as of this writing. Then there is the matter of the spearhead itself. Its four-pronged design has been repeatedly described by researchers as exceptionally rare across the entire South Caucasus, a detail that raises a natural question. Was this a weapon crafted locally, using a specialized technique unique to this particular community or workshop? Or does its unusual design suggest contact with, or influence from, a more distant metalworking tradition? Evidence, perhaps, of trade networks or cultural exchange reaching this remote plain from regions considerably further afield than researchers currently understand? The presence of obsidian tools within the burial adds another thread to this same question, since obsidian sourcing can sometimes be traced to specific volcanic deposits, potentially revealing trade routes that connected this community to distant corners of the ancient world. Full sourcing and comparative analysis of these materials has not yet been completed. And then there's the circular limestone seal recovered from within the earthen mound, a small, unassuming object that researchers have suggested may point toward early forms of administrative control or concepts of property ownership. If accurate, this detail hints at something larger than a single warrior's grave. The possibility that the society which built this kurgan had already developed structured systems of authority, record-keeping, or personal ownership nearly 4,000 years ago, on a remote plain far from the more famous administrative centers of the ancient Near East. How sophisticated was that system? What did this seal actually mark or authorize in life? For now, the object itself offers only a hint, its full significance still pending further study. The excavation at Kechelekeran has run continuously for 5 years, drawing nearly 2,000 participants across university programs, regional museums, and local schools, and researchers have indicated that further seasons are planned, alongside laboratory analyses including radiocarbon dating, isotope studies, and detailed metallurgical examination of the recovered bronze. A comprehensive, scholarly monograph documenting the full scope of the Kechelekeran kurgans is reportedly in preparation, promising a more complete picture than currently exists. For now, the warrior of Yovshanladur remains only partially understood. A man of extraordinary height, buried beneath a ton of deliberately placed stone, holding a weapon whose origins remain uncertain, watched over by a bull-shaped idol whose full meaning has not yet been recovered. Was he a local leader whose community simply had access to unusually skilled metalworkers? Or does his tomb mark the presence of a wider network of contact and exchange, stretching far beyond what researchers currently know about this remote corner of the Bronze Age world. The plain that held him in silence for 38 centuries has, for now, only begun to answer. From an anonymous giant buried beneath a ton of Caucasus limestone, our path now bends westward once more, into the ruined stone city of Ani, a place so vast, so thoroughly abandoned, that visitors still describe wandering its silent streets as walking through the shell of an empire that simply stopped breathing. Ani sits in Turkey's Kars province, in the country's far northeastern corner, close enough to the border that its ruins occupy a genuinely liminal position, historically, culturally, geographically. For centuries, this city functioned as a gateway, the point where Central Asia opened into Anatolia, and where the Caucasus met Asia Minor. Today, it stands recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its skyline still dominated by the remains of medieval churches, mosques, and fortifications that once made it, in the words of lead excavator Associate Professor Muhammad Arslan, one of the most magnificent cities of the medieval era. Founded under the Bagratid Dynasty, Ani would go on to be ruled, in succession, by the Byzantine Empire, the Great Seljuk Empire, the Kingdom of Georgia, the Mongols, the Ilkhanids, and a rotating cast of Turkic and Persianate powers that followed. A city passed from hand to hand across nearly a millennium, shaped by each new ruler who claimed it. The turning point that draws archaeologists back to Ani year after year came in 1064, when Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan conquered the city, an event still commemorated as a foundational moment in Turkish Islamic history in Anatolia. According to historical accounts, the Sultan personally led the first Friday prayer held in Anatolia at the site of what had been Ani's cathedral, subsequently converted into the Fethiye Mosque. That single act, a conqueror praying inside a captured cathedral, marks, symbolically and historically, the beginning of a new chapter for the region, one whose physical traces archaeologists are now recovering directly from the ground. Since 2021, excavation teams working under the joint direction of Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism and Kafkas University have focused considerable attention on a plot of land roughly 30 meters southwest of the Fethi Mosque, a site that surface findings first suggested, and subsequent digging confirmed, was a cemetery. Not simply any cemetery, but what Arslan has described as the first Turkish Islamic burial ground in all of Anatolia, established in the immediate aftermath of the Seljuk conquest, in the literal shadow of the mosque where that conquest had been ceremonially sealed. What emerged from the soil over successive excavation seasons reads like a careful catalog of medieval Islamic funerary architecture, translated from its Central Asian origins into new Anatolian stone. Early seasons uncovered a Seljuk kumbet, a distinctive tomb tower, built with an octagonal upper body set upon a square base, a design directly inherited from Seljuk funerary traditions further east. Alongside it, researchers documented Sanduka-style tombstones, raised stone markers placed above graves, and Akhet-type burial chambers, a construction method well known from Central Asian tradition and clearly adapted here in an Islamized form, suited to its new Anatolian setting. In the most recent excavation season, in September 2025, the team uncovered the remains of a second kumbet, this one built with a brick body rather than stone, a detail Arslan has called potentially significant on its own terms. For the architecture of kumbets in Anatolia, he noted, this may be among the very first examples. We could even call it a first. Why would that distinction matter so much to researchers? Because the Seljuks, prior to their conquest of Anatolia, had already developed a well-established tradition of using brick for such monumental tombs in their earlier territories, particularly across Iran. A brick-built kumbet at Ani, constructed in the earliest years of Seljuk presence in the region, would represent a direct architectural transplant, physical evidence of builders bringing a specific, regionally distinct construction technique with them as they settled newly conquered territory, before that technique was gradually adapted or replaced by locally available materials and building traditions more suited to Anatolia's landscape. In other words, this modest brick tomb tower may function as a kind of architectural fingerprint, marking the precise moment when an Eastern building tradition first took root on Anatolian soil, before evolving into something distinctly its own. The mainstream picture, then, is coherent and well supported by the archaeological record. A conquering power established a burial ground immediately beside its most symbolically significant religious conversion, populated that ground with individuals honored according to funerary customs carried from their homeland, and gradually, over generations, allowed that imported tradition to adapt to local materials and Anatolian architectural sensibilities. Under this reading, each new find at the site, another Sanduka tombstone, another kumbet, whether stone or brick, simply adds further texture and confirmation to an already well-understood historical transition. And yet, standing at the edge of an excavation that remains, by its own team's admission, still very much in progress, several questions resist easy resolution. Who, precisely, was buried within these tombs? A cemetery this deliberately positioned, immediately adjacent to the site of Sultan Alp Arslan's symbolic first prayer, would seem an obvious location for individuals of considerable status. Military commanders, religious figures, perhaps members of the earliest Seljuk administrative class installed to govern the newly conquered city. But without inscriptions definitively naming the occupants of these graves, that identification remains, for now, an inference drawn from location and architectural investment rather than a documented certainty. Excavation continues, and researchers have not yet reported definitive identifications for the individuals interred within either kumbet. There is also the broader question of how completely Annie's Seljuk-era history has actually been recovered. The 2025 and 2026 excavation seasons, running from April through the end of December each year, have spread across not just the cemetery, but 5 separate locations throughout the ancient city. A Seljuk marketplace stretching along the commercial axis between the Aslan Legate and the Grand Mosque, a residential neighborhood believed to have stood west of that same mosque, and a Bezer Hain, a facility researchers believe was used for oil production. Each of these sites represents a different facet of daily Seljuk life at Ani: trade, domestic life, industry, and now, burial practice, being reconstructed piece by piece from ground that had lain undisturbed in some cases for over 1,000 years. Arslan has noted that despite centuries of wars, occupations, invasions, and earthquakes, Ani continues to reveal new heritage with each excavation season, a statement that carries an implicit acknowledgement. However much has already been uncovered, a great deal more likely remains buried beneath a city whose full population, at its medieval peak, is believed to have rivaled some of the era's great urban centers, yet whose modern excavated footprint still represents only a fraction of its original extent. The comparison to another recent Turkish discovery is difficult to avoid. Research conducted on the Royal Seljuk tomb in Konya has, through DNA and anatomical analysis, recently yielded detailed physical profiles of several Seljuk sultans, revealing genetic conditions, lineage, and even likely causes of death for rulers whose remains had rested largely unexamined for centuries. If similarly detailed analysis were one day applied to the individuals interred within Ani's Seljuk cemetery, might their remains offer comparable insight, not into the health of a single royal dynasty, but into the broader population of Turks who settled this contested borderland city in the decades immediately following its conquest. For now, that remains a hypothetical extension of the current excavation, not a confirmed research direction. What Ani offers, in the end, is not a single dramatic revelation, but something perhaps more valuable to historians. A slow, careful accumulation of physical evidence, documenting how one civilization's architectural and religious traditions took root in newly conquered soil, tomb by tomb, brick by brick. The city's cemetery has already yielded 2 distinct kumbits, 1 stone, 1 brick, separated by construction techniques that may represent successive phases of Seljuk settlement and adaptation. As excavation continues through the current season and likely well beyond it, the full population of this pioneering Turkish Islamic burial ground and the specific identities of those who chose to be laid to rest in the shadow of a conquered cathedral remain only partially recovered. How many more tombs still lie beneath Ani's silent ground, marking the graves of the men and women who first carried Seljuk tradition into Anatolia? And what will it mean if researchers one day succeed in giving names and faces back to the individuals whose bones have waited patiently in the shadow of the Fethiye Mosque for nearly 1,000 years? From the tomb towers of Ani, where an empire's conquerors buried their dead beside a captured cathedral, our story now returns once more to Azerbaijan, not to the windswept highlands this time, but to the country's fertile southern lowlands, where a road crew doing ordinary infrastructure work uncovered the quiet, unglamorous remains of people who simply lived, worked, and were never meant to be found again. In the summer of 2025, road construction crews working in the village of Kechelekeran in Azerbaijan's Yardımlı district near the country's southern border struck something beneath the ground that halted the project and brought in archaeologists from the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology of Anis. The location itself offered an immediate clue to what they might find. Kechelekeran sits on the right bank of the Vilyashche River, a waterway whose steady flow would have made this stretch of land attractive to settlement long before recorded history began. Sure enough, beneath the disturbed earth, the team uncovered the foundations of an ancient settlement, its dwellings built from river stones gathered directly from the banks nearby, practical, locally sourced construction, the kind of architecture that speaks less to grandeur than to the patient, repeated labor of ordinary domestic life. Unlike the warrior's Kurgan uncovered elsewhere in Azerbaijan that same year, with its towering occupant and rare ceremonial spearhead, Kechelekeran offered no singular dramatic centerpiece. What it offered instead was something archaeologists often value just as highly, if less headline-grabbing: a detailed, textured picture of everyday Bronze Age life. Excavators recovered fragments of domestic pottery in a range of shapes and sizes, evidence of a household ceramic tradition developed and refined over generations. They found miniature household items, whose specific functions remain, in some cases, still under interpretation. They uncovered bone spindle whorls, small, weighted tools used to spin raw fiber into thread, physical proof of an active textile industry operating within this small riverside community. And scattered throughout the site, researchers documented numerous osteological remains belonging to both large and small livestock, indicating that animal husbandry formed a substantial part of the settlement's domestic economy. Taken together, these finds paint a coherent, well-supported picture: a settled agricultural and pastoral community, established along a reliable water source that had developed reasonably sophisticated traditions of pottery making and textile production to support its daily needs. Investigations at the site, which archaeologists have dated broadly to the late Bronze through early Iron Age, continue in the surrounding area, part of a wider pattern of ongoing excavation across the Yardımlı district. This is, by most accounts, exactly the kind of discovery that quietly, steadily reshapes historical understanding, not through a single spectacular revelation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence about how people actually lived, generation after generation, in a landscape whose surface gives few outward signs of what lies beneath. Why then does a settlement like Kechelekeran still leave room for genuine, open questions? Partly because of what surrounds it. Azerbaijan's Bronze and Iron Age archaeological record, taken as a whole, reveals a landscape of striking cultural density and diversity for a relatively compact territory. The early Bronze Age here belonged to the Kurgan culture, a tradition that extended far beyond modern Azerbaijan's borders, stretching across the wider Trans-Caucasus region, northwestern Iran, eastern Anatolia, and beyond, evidence of a population that grew and spread across enormous distances while maintaining recognizable, shared material traditions. By the late Bronze and early Iron Age, the period into which Kechelekeran settlement most likely falls, the region had diversified further still, giving rise to distinct archaeological cultures including Kechelekeran, Nakhchivan, and Talishmugan traditions, each associated with its own burial customs, fortification styles, and material culture. Cyclopean-style hill forts, built from massive interlocking stones, appeared across the Lesser Caucasus during this same broad period, evidence of a landscape where communities increasingly needed, or chose, to defend fixed settlements rather than remain purely mobile. Where, precisely, does the community at Kechelekeran fit within this wider mosaic of overlapping Bronze Age cultures? The settlement's building materials, dwellings constructed from river stones, align with construction practices documented at other regional sites of comparable age, but the specific cultural affiliation of this particular community and its relationship to neighboring settlements along the same river system remains a question current excavation has not yet fully answered. Was this a relatively isolated agricultural community, largely self-sufficient and disconnected from the wider currents of exchange moving through the Caucasus during this period? Or did its position on the Vilyashche River place it within a broader regional network, trading textiles, livestock, or pottery with neighboring settlements whose remains have yet to be identified, or lie buried beneath modern villages that, unlike Kechelekeran, have never had cause for a road crew to dig deep enough to find them? There is also the matter of chronology. Researchers have placed the settlement broadly within the late Bronze to early Iron Age transition, a span that, across the wider region, covers several centuries of gradual technological and social change. Firmer dating, through radiocarbon analysis or detailed ceramic typology comparison with better documented regional sequences, would help situate Kechelekeran more precisely within this timeline, potentially clarifying whether the settlement represents an earlier, more traditional phase of Bronze Age life in the region, or a later community already beginning to adopt the ironworking technologies and cultural shifts associated with the era's end. That work, as far as current reporting indicates, remains ongoing. Perhaps the most quietly compelling aspect of Kechelekeran is simply how it was found at all. Not through a planned excavation targeting a known or suspected archaeological site, but incidentally during infrastructure work that had nothing to do with archaeology in the first place. This is, in fact, a remarkably common pattern across Azerbaijan's recent archaeological record. The Norfolk Carnyx Hoard in England emerged from routine housing development surveys. London's Roman Basilica surfaced only because an aging office block was scheduled for demolition. And here, in Azerbaijan's rural south, it was road construction, not scholarly inquiry, that brought Kechelekeran's Bronze Age foundations back into the light. Each of these discoveries raises the same uncomfortable, unavoidable question. How much of the ancient world remains buried beneath modern infrastructure simply because no one has yet had reason to dig in the right place? Azerbaijan alone has yielded, within a matter of months, an entirely unrelated 3,800-year-old warrior's tomb in the Seyrancho Plain and this quieter riverside settlement in Yardımlı, two finds separated by hundreds of kilometers and likely centuries of time, both surfacing only because construction crews happened to break ground exactly where ancient communities had once chosen to build. Kechelekeran will likely never generate the same public fascination as a golden death mask or a towering warrior's grave. Its story, as currently understood, is one of ordinary continuity. People spinning thread, herding livestock, shaping clay into vessels, generation after generation, along a river that still flows through the same landscape today. But ordinary continuity carries its own quiet mystery. Who were the specific people who called this stretch of riverbank home? And what name, if any, did they give to their small community? How did their daily lives connect, or fail to connect, to the broader currents of exchange and cultural change sweeping across the Caucasus during the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age? And as excavation continues in the surrounding district, how many more settlements like this one? Modest, undramatic, but quietly essential to understanding how ordinary Bronze Age life actually functioned, remain waiting beneath Azerbaijan's fields and roadways, needing only the right excuse to finally come to light. From the modest riverside foundations of Kechelekeran, our journey turns west again, into eastern Anatolia, where a single splash of color beneath a farmer's shovel would eventually reveal a bathhouse designed for people who had never known cold water without warning them first. In 2023, in the small village of Salkaya, in Turkey's Elazığ province, a local farmer was digging a modest pit to plant cherry saplings when his shovel struck something unmistakably artificial: fragments of a mosaic floor, its surface still holding traces of color after 17 centuries underground. Even in its damaged partial state, the design was striking, a scene populated with animals rendered in careful detail, including lions, boars, and leopards, worked into the floor with the kind of skill that spoke immediately of wealth and artistic investment rather than rural improvisation. It was, unmistakably, Roman. The discovery prompted Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, working alongside the Provincial Directorate of Culture and Tourism and the Elazığ Museum Directorate, to investigate further. Rather than digging blindly across the surrounding farmland, the team turned to ground-penetrating radar, scanning the earth roughly 220 feet south of the mosaic to search for any additional buried structures the technology might reveal. The results confirmed their instincts. Beneath the soil lay the outline of an entire building, and when excavation began, that outline resolved into a Roman bathhouse of genuine sophistication, the first of its kind ever documented within Elazığ province. What emerged, across excavation seasons in 2024 and 2025, was a structure covering roughly 75 square meters, complete with the full suite of features that defined Roman bathing culture at its most refined. Distinct cold, warm, and hot water sections, dedicated sweat rooms, pools, and a carefully engineered system of channels designed to carry both clean water in and wastewater safely out. At the heart of the complex sat the caldarium, the hot bathing room, still preserved well enough for archaeologists to identify a network of small support columns known as suspensorae, standing beneath what had once been the raised floor. This was physical evidence of a hypocaust system, the ingenious Roman method of central heating in which hot air, generated by a nearby furnace, circulated beneath elevated floors and through channels built directly into the walls, warming an entire room without a single visible flame. The hypocaust represented one of Rome's genuine engineering triumphs, a technology so effective it is still regarded today as a direct conceptual ancestor of modern underfloor heating systems found in luxury homes. While earlier civilizations, including the Greeks and Persians, had experimented with various forms of heated flooring, it was Roman engineers who perfected and standardized the technique, making it a defining feature of public baths and elite private villas across the empire, from Bath in England to Pompeii in Italy, and now, evidently, to this quiet stretch of farmland in eastern Anatolia as well. Provincial Director of Culture and Tourism, Ahmet Demirda, was direct about what the sophistication of the find implied. "We discovered a Roman bath that belonged to the upper-level ruling class of that period," he told Turkish media, noting that the structure's design, underfloor heating, and overall technical execution marked it as a high-level structure by the standards of its era. Archaeologist Emre Sayar, who has led much of the site's ongoing analysis, echoed this assessment, describing the bathhouse as a direct testimony to Roman daily life and architectural ingenuity in a region not typically associated with such elaborate imperial infrastructure. Under the conventional, well-supported reading, the explanation for what Salkaya represents follows naturally from what was found. Rome's conquest of Anatolia began in the 2nd century BC, gradually absorbing the region into an empire whose administrative and cultural reach extended, eventually, into even its more remote eastern territories. A bathhouse of this caliber, complete with Hippocaust heating and finely crafted mosaic flooring, would not have been built for a passing garrison or a handful of isolated farmers. Structures like this required significant investment, skilled labor, and a settled population wealthy enough to sustain them. Evidence, in other words, that a genuine Roman settlement, likely centered around an elite family or a broader urban community, once thrived on this ground, fully integrated into the empire's wider cultural and economic fabric. And yet, this is precisely where the discovery's most interesting question begins, rather than ends. Despite the bathhouse's clear sophistication, no one has yet located the settlement it almost certainly served. Sayar has proposed that the area surrounding the mosaic and bath complex likely represents what was once a rural town center, with additional structures still waiting, undiscovered, somewhere beneath the surrounding farmland. Local officials have already registered 30 acres of land around the site for further archaeological exploration, a scale of commitment that reflects genuine confidence that more remains buried nearby. But confidence is not confirmation. As of the most recent reporting, the residential quarters, civic buildings, and burial grounds that would typically accompany a settlement wealthy enough to support such an elaborate bathhouse have not yet been definitively located. This absence invites a set of genuinely open questions. How large was this settlement at its height? Was it a substantial town in its own right, with its own local governance and economic identity, or a smaller elite estate, perhaps built around a single prominent family whose private wealth funded amenities more commonly associated with larger Roman cities? The mosaic's imagery, lions, boars, leopards, animals evoking both the exoticism of the wider Roman world and the hunting culture prized among its elite, hints at patrons with cosmopolitan tastes and resources extending well beyond what a purely local, self-contained rural community might typically command. Did the individuals who once soaked in Salkaya's heated pools maintain active connections to more distant corners of the empire, importing artistic styles and cultural fashions from far beyond eastern Anatolia? Or did local craftsmen, working within a genuinely provincial context, simply produce imperial caliber work using skills and materials available closer to home? There is also the matter of what happened to this settlement, and when and why. Archaeologists have dated the bath complex to roughly the 3rd century AD, placing it within Rome's late imperial period. a turbulent era marked across the empire more broadly by political instability, economic strain, and increasing pressure along Rome's eastern frontiers, including from the rival Sassanid Persian Empire, whose territory bordered Roman Anatolia. Was Salkaya's Roman community ultimately abandoned due to these broader imperial pressures, its residents relocating as regional security or economic conditions shifted? Did it persist for generations after the bathhouse's construction, only fading gradually as Roman administrative structures in the wider region eventually transformed under Byzantine rule? Or does some more specific, localized event explain why a bathhouse this elaborate was eventually buried and forgotten, its location lost to memory until a farmer's cherry sapling pit brought it back into view 17 centuries later? Current excavation has not yet produced a clear answer. The broader pattern here echoes discoveries examined elsewhere in this exploration. Sophisticated infrastructure surfacing not through deliberate, targeted archaeological search, but through pure incidental circumstance. A single agricultural task revealing a doorway into a much larger, still largely invisible ancient world. Just as London's Basilica waited beneath an office block scheduled for demolition, and Norfolk's Carnyx Hoard waited beneath land marked for housing development, Salkaya's bathhouse waited beneath ordinary farmland, its existence entirely unsuspected until an unrelated act of planting brought its edge into contact with a farmer's shovel. How many more such structures might be sitting, similarly undisturbed, beneath the agricultural land surrounding Elazığ and the wider eastern Anatolian countryside, visible to ground-penetrating radar the moment someone thinks to point it at the right patch of soil, but otherwise indistinguishable from any other unremarkable field? For now, excavation at Salkaya continues under the supervision of the Elazığ Museum Directorate, with researchers hoping that future seasons will uncover the residential and civic structures that would confirm the full scale of the settlement this bathhouse once served. The mosaic's lions, boars, and leopards remain frozen mid-stride on a floor built for people whose names, occupations, and ultimate fate remain entirely unknown. Somewhere beneath the 30 acres now marked for further exploration, the rest of their story, who they were, how they lived, and why their town eventually vanished from both the historical record and the landscape itself, may still be waiting to be uncovered. From a hidden bathhouse beneath Anatolian farmland, our journey now sails north, into the cold soil of southwestern Norway, where a hobbyist's careless glance very nearly let a piece of Viking history slip back into obscurity, mistaken, of all things, for a button. In April 2025, in a field near Utstein Abbey on Norway's southwestern coast, a metal detectorist named Morten Eek, a member of the Rygene Detector Club, unearthed a small metal object from the plow layer of soil, buried only 10 to 15 centimeters beneath the surface, shallow enough to suggest it had been disturbed repeatedly over the centuries by nothing more dramatic than routine farming. One side of the object gleamed with the unmistakable shine of silver. The other appeared dull, coppery, marked by a dark spot at its center. To Eek, it looked exactly like the kind of post-medieval clothing button detectorists routinely pull from Norwegian farmland. The ordinary background noise of the hobby, rarely worth a second look. He took it home and set it aside in a bucket, alongside other worn coins, scraps of metal, and assorted uncertain finds accumulated over seasons of searching. It might have stayed there indefinitely. Months later, showing his collected odds and ends to fellow detectorists, Eek and his companions finally noticed what had been sitting in plain sight all along: a clearly visible cross design on the object's shinier face. Under closer examination with a magnifying lens, the supposed copper button revealed itself to be something else entirely. A plate of copper that had been deliberately attached to one side of a much older object, its edges folded carefully around the rim to hold it in place. That detail, combined with the cross motif and a passing resemblance to an illustration Eek recalled from a 19th century reference work on Norwegian medieval coinage, was enough to prompt the detectorists to contact professionals. They brought the object to the University of Stavanger Museum of Archaeology. What researchers there confirmed was remarkable. This was not a button of any era. It was a silver coin, roughly 900 years old, struck during the reign of Magnus Barefoot, known in Norwegian as Magnus Barefoot, a king often described as the last true Viking ruler of Norway. Magnus Barefoot's biography reads like a study in contrast to the man who preceded him. He ascended the throne in 1093, following the death of his father, Olaf Kyrre, whose reign had been remembered as an unusually peaceful stretch in Norwegian history. Magnus took Norway in a decidedly different direction. Grandson of Harald Hardrada, the warrior king famously killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, Magnus built his own reputation through aggressive military campaigns, extending Norwegian influence across the Western Isles, the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and into parts of Ireland. That expansionist ambition ultimately cost him his life. In 1103, at around 30 years old, Magnus was ambushed and killed during his second Western military campaign in Ireland, a violent end befitting a reign defined largely by warfare rather than diplomacy. Beyond his battlefield ambitions, Magnus Barefoot is also remembered for something quieter but historically significant: currency reform. During his reign, he introduced new coinage that was notably lighter in weight than earlier Norwegian issues, while maintaining a high silver content, a combination that produced coins of considerably higher quality than what had circulated before, evidence of a ruler paying close attention to the practical mechanics of economic administration even amid constant military campaigning. The coin found near Utstein Abbey turned out to be exceptionally rare, and not simply because of its royal association. When researchers examined the object using X-ray imaging, deliberately choosing not to remove the copper plate, since the alteration itself was judged an important part of the artifact's own history, they found something hidden beneath the copper covering: a griffin motif paired on the coin's visible side with a distinctive crossover cross design. This specific combination of imagery, griffin on one face and crossover cross on the other, is known from only 4 coins anywhere in the world with a documented cultural context. One was previously found on the island of Sandu in the Faroe Islands. The other 3 came from a single hoard discovered at Lundby Krat near Aalborg, Denmark. The Utstein coin marked the first time this particular type had ever been found on the Norwegian mainland itself, a striking absence given that Magnus Barefoot was, after all, King of Norway. In total, researchers estimate that only around 100 coins struck during Magnus Barefoot's reign have ever been recovered, scattered across a small number of archaeological finds, with confirmed Norwegian discoveries limited to sites including Herken, Trondheim, and now Utstein. Archaeologist Linn Lillian Eike Ramberg, who led the analysis at the University of Stavanger, noted that coins from this period are especially difficult to recover through metal detecting in the first place, given their tiny size, typically weighing around only 0.4 grams, easy to overlook even under ideal conditions. Here, the story's more genuinely puzzling layer begins. Someone, at some point after this coin was minted, deliberately altered it, attaching that copper plate, folding the coin's original edge carefully around it, and, based on 2 small notches identified along the rim, likely fastening a chain or cord to convert the coin into a piece of wearable jewelry. Why would someone take a rare, high-quality royal coin, already valuable simply as currency, and repurpose it this way? Researchers have suggested it may reflect the coin's later significance as a personal keepsake, an amulet, or a decorative object valued for reasons that had shifted away from pure monetary function towards something more personal, worn, perhaps, as a visible marker of status, memory, or even superstition. This kind of secondary modification, transforming currency into jewelry, is documented elsewhere in Viking and medieval Scandinavian material culture, though the specific motivations behind any individual instance are rarely recoverable from the object alone. There is a fitting irony embedded in that transformation. Ramberg herself noted that the copper plate, whatever its original purpose, may well be the very reason this small, fragile coin survived at all, undamaged, across 9 centuries buried in agricultural soil, and further, the reason a metal detector was ever able to locate it, since a copper addition would likely have produced a stronger, more consistent signal than the tiny silver coin alone. In other words, the same alteration that once obscured the coin's true identity from a hobbyist's eye may be precisely what preserved it well enough to eventually be found and correctly identified 900 years later. Beyond the mystery of who wore it and why, researchers see genuine scholarly opportunity in the coin's physical details. The Utstein specimen appears to have been struck using the same die as one of the Danish examples from the Lundby Krat hoard, a detail that matters considerably to numismatic researchers, since shared dies between coins found in different countries can reveal how minting operations were organized, whether a single workshop produced coins later distributed across considerable distances, or whether die-sharing arrangements existed between different regional mints during this transitional period at the very close of the Viking Age. If confirmed through further comparative analysis, this die link would offer evidence that coinage under Magnus Barefoot, whatever its symbolic importance to later generations, may have remained genuinely limited in overall production volume. A small, carefully controlled operation rather than a widely distributed currency system. Museum researchers have been candid about how much remains unknown, framing this single coin as a genuinely significant addition to a very small existing dataset. As they noted in their public statement, it is a fascinating thought that archaeologists may be only one substantial treasure discovery away from an entirely revised understanding of Magnus Barefoot's coinage system as a whole. A reminder that with barely 100 known examples worldwide, each individual find carries outsized weight in shaping what historians currently believe about coin production at the very end of Norway's Viking era. For now, the coin sits in its altered state at the University of Stavanger, copper plate still intact, its hidden griffin visible only through X-ray, its original owner, and the reasons for its transformation into jewelry left entirely to inference. Somewhere between Magnus Barefoot's currency reforms and its eventual burial in a Norwegian field, this small silver object passed through hands whose stories we may never fully recover. What, precisely, did it mean to the person who converted it from currency into something worn close to the body? And how many more coins from this brief, violent reign, misidentified as buttons, scrap, or worthless debris, might still be sitting, unrecognized, in detectorists' collection buckets across Norway, waiting for someone to finally take a second, closer look